You've got fund companies raising $450 million in a round these days. It's almost an impossibility to say, no, thank you. I don't want your $100 million check at really ridiculously good terms.
Welcome to the Startup Defense. Today I have Heather Richman. Heather, you have worn many hats. So I recognize you from BM&T, but you have some really exciting other things that you've been quietly working on. So I'd love to get into that. Can you tell the audience who you are, what's your background, and what you're really passionate about right now?
Callye, thank you for having me. What you're creating here, I think, is a really important platform for folks like myself who are doing things a little bit out of the spotlight, which is how we like it sometimes, but doing things that are important for our country and building, I'll say, ecosystems that are not traditional. So non-traditional ecosystems outside of government and outside of the Defense Department of mission-aligned people. Touch on that a little bit later, but thank you for having me. I'm a mom, first of all. I've got 2 daughters who are almost 12 and almost 15. That kind of started my career as an appropriator in Washington, D.C. I was there for about 5 years working for Senator Schumer from New York. That spanned from 99 to 2004. And the middle of that was 9/11. And so I think a lot of people who are listening or who might be interested in this area of work is, where does mission focus come from? Where do you get that passion to do something that matters to you and maybe matters to your country? That's where it came from for me. And I think, I hear the story quite a bit of people in my generation that were in their 20s and 9/11 happened. That's where it comes from for me. I wake up every day thinking about it. I'm a very energetic and happy person, but I think every day about the security of our country, the safety of our country, the safety of my daughters in our country, and what their future is going to look like. And so that's where it comes from. And once you kind of have that and you find something, whether you're an entrepreneur and you find, a technology or capability that needs to be successful, you work your fingers off. You work day and night to make sure that that happens. In the world that we work in, I know that you've had my boss, Pete Newell, on before, and he's one of those people that works day and night and that you don't get exhausted doing it. It's kind of amazing. And you meet other people who are like-minded and they give you more energy and more purpose. I was in DC, came back out to California where I'm from. I'm from Southern California. I've spent a lot of time up here in Northern California, but I live right here on Sand Hill Road. And so I'm right in the middle of this place called Silicon Valley. I like to take it a step further. And, I think the innovation community, the Silicon Valley, actually then incorporates also lots of innovative places here in the country where private capital is being put to use to support entrepreneurs. But I'll call it, for what it's worth, Silicon Valley, because that's exactly where I live. And got back here and was actually running government relations for Stanford for a number of years. But I had this, stanford.edu email account. And so I just started pinging venture investors and find out what makes investors tick, what makes people who work in private capital wake up every day and do what they do and passionate about what they do. And I learned quite a bit how they diligence and how they look for new opportunities and how I've come to see them as kind of the eyes and ears of innovation and of industry. And so something that I talk about and we can touch on later is it's kind of been this tipping point in the last 5, 6, 7 years about, more commercial side capabilities being used inside the government, but specifically the military. And how do we find, world-class talent? And then how, frankly, do we convince them to maybe take a bit of a different path and to think about national security as they're building their company? And I know I'm going all over the place right now, but there's this concept called dual use, right? You've got the commercial side and then potentially the government and military side. What does that look like? And we can get into a little bit more about that. But I think this idea of building a dual use company, even though you might be commercially facing first, we might, put it out in the commercial sector, figure out if it works, figure out if it integrates, figure out if it's going to be successful. And at that point, then potentially go a government route. But the way you might build a dual use company from day one might look a little different than if you're building a commercially facing company that then later decides, oh, we should be dual use. Having some of that intelligence around company building, taking out some of the guesswork, but also a lot of what I do and one of the reasons I'm really excited that you started this podcast is honestly just educating each other about the private sector and the commercial sector and then the government sector. I spend a lot of time translating, whether it's acronyms or even just timelines, what you can expect, what investors expect, what entrepreneurs expect, and how we've run into a lot of challenges. I think we use the term valley of death, right? There's more than one valley of death. The way an entrepreneur might see that first valley of death is first money into revenue. That's a valley of death when you get your first dollars of investment in until you have revenue. That's a very different valley of death than what the Department of Defense talks about. And so I think sometimes just translating that, but also educating. I think one thing that BM&T does very, very well is build upon trusted relationships inside the DoD to help translate what industry is actually dealing with, and frankly, which direction industry is going.
I want to pull a couple of great points out of this. One, you're the geographic equivalent of what this podcast is about is Silicon Valley. So all of, our friends in San Jose up to San Francisco and in Fremont and all that, and then combining DC. I'm in DC. You're in California. There's no industry that has more acronyms and jargon than DoD. Second, and maybe a close second, is manufacturing. And startup world has its own whole vocabulary, not just acronyms, just whole own way of speaking and thinking about things. So a translator is absolutely required. And it's great to see people that have venture experience and have DoD experience go out there and say, I want to connect these dots together. The dual use premise, I am very passionate about, because this is something that I've personally experienced, is that when we're going and providing innovation to a group, I noticed that a lot of the other people that we might be competing with or that are operating in the space, they don't actually have product. They have capabilities, which is a different avenue. But as I've worked more with startups, I realized that they don't know anything about the DoD space at all. And I could reach out to them and say, you have a proven commercial product. It works. And I can day zero bring that right to DoD and say, guys, we don't need to reinvent a radio. We don't need to reinvent this type of encryption. We don't need to reinvent all of these things that you're trying to do. Drones, perfect example. You go on and on. Sensor systems, everything that's really, really important. It needs upgrading and translating, and it definitely needs transformational change and secure supply chain. And there's lots of other problems. So I'm not saying, hey, this is a 1-2 knockout punch, so simple, but I see a lot of unnecessary invention happening on the DoD side. So very expensive, getting suboptimal products. And then I see a lot of startups on the other side really struggling because of that first revenue in, that money, and connecting with customers and say, hey, I can take you to a demo and put your MVP product in front of somebody, and they're going to fund you right away because what you have is asymmetrically better than anything else in the market. But for a commercial product, it's not finished. It's a really fun conversation about dual use. I don't think people really understand the massive chasm of a value gap that there is potentially for innovators. That's why I launched the show, because this is my two big passionate things. I want to know more about the investor network and really what you've seen these opportunities bringing dual use companies into DoD and what that looks like from an investor perspective.
I've been taking notes because I want to circle back on a couple other things too after I talk about the Defense Investor Network. On the entrepreneurial side or the innovation side, there's a lot of translation between the venture community. What is venture capital? What is private equity? What does private capital mean? What is trusted private capital? What is nefarious capital? All these things. And, go back to a different vocabulary. You get somebody from the DoD speaking to a venture investor, you're speaking entirely different languages. And I've sat in rooms with very accomplished and very successful venture investors, and we'll say a 3 or 4 star, and they're almost embarrassed to speak to one another because there's so much misunderstanding. And that's gotten significantly better. 2018 is when I think people started to really have this conversation, and it's been amazing to watch, actually. But there was definitely a period of time there where out here in Silicon Valley, everyone's very heads down. You're going as fast as you can. What's your unfair advantage? First to market, all of these sorts of things. And you kind of let the market decide who are the winners and who aren't the winners. And then DoD is really changing, I think, holistically. We have a new face of war all of a sudden. And so you were talking about products, and I promise you I'll get to the investors. You were talking about product, but for the first time, we were putting blank as a service in front of the DoD, or really, I'll say in 2015, cyber, obviously cyber AI, these things that you can't necessarily touch and feel, but that are being used as weapons, frankly, against us already, right? And so I remember, I'll tell you a quick story. We had General Nakasone, the former head of Cyber Command, come out, and I had this feeling, and he brought members of his team out, and they were looking at how are we going to start attacking this problem that is cyber. And for the first time, you've got a problem that is constantly evolving, constantly changing. It's a dynamic problem. You don't buy a piece of hardware and shoot it. It may not be a better battery. I mean, all those things are very important too, but it was these things that were almost impossible to see, but you could see the consequences of it if we weren't doing anything about it. And his team came out, and I kind of had this vision of, it felt like they were standing on the edge of a swimming pool, and they so desperately wanted to jump in, but they didn't have a game plan yet. And with such a dynamic and all-encompassing problem, and after having spoken to so many cyber investors and cyber entrepreneurs out here, it was this idea like, you just got to jump in. You just got to start dog paddling, and then you're going to build a plane as you're flying it. You're going to learn how to swim while you're in the pool. And, that's how a lot of things happen out here is people say, you can't be afraid to fail. And that's a term that doesn't always go over so well with the Department of Defense because, when you're talking about failing, you're talking about national security, you're talking about loss of life sometimes. You're putting real people in harm's way. So even that little phrase, don't be afraid to fail. I said, how about don't be afraid to throw a bunch of stuff against the wall?
Don't be afraid to pilot or POC an idea.
And then to start iterating and to start pivoting and to be, instead of using a failure, you're learning what works and what doesn't. Is that failure? No, not if you're learning from it. How do we realign that and just say, let's go? And so one of the things that we at BM&T started to realize was you can't have, a 3 or 4 person cyber startup present to the head of cyber command and expect that in 4 weeks, the company is going to be mature enough to work with them, or then in 4 weeks, Cyber Command is going to be in a position, and I'm just picking on Cyber Command right now, to have a contract. Back to kind of the translation piece, how do we just start the conversation and get folks on the DoD side, and we can talk about classification in a minute because it's a big, big barrier, but how do we get folks able to have a conversation or a series of conversations with world-class talent? And maybe it's a team that hasn't yet become a company. Maybe it is a full-fledged company. In this case, I said, what if we put the CISO of Visa in front of them to say, how does Visa do this? Because when cyber first started to be what cyber is now, financial services were the first place they were targeting. And so if you look at who has the best, defenses against cyber, it's financial services. And so why isn't our military speaking to all the, the CISOs and chief cyber officers of all the financial, services companies? It makes a ton of sense. And so I said, let's just, bring Ajit in here and just have the coolest conversation. And there was no pretense. There was no egos. It was just like, you could ask every dumb question that you wanted to ask. And I think providing, I know this does sound very touchy-feely, but sometimes providing those safe places to have conversations where you might feel a little bit embarrassed. As industry's moving along, cyber, the sophistication there has skyrocketed. But just watching that initial conversation was incredible. And the way they completely rethought then how they're going to go after a cyber strategy. And you mentioned you might have a product or a capability. Typically, why do we have primes? Typically, it takes 20 different solutions, 20 different products, 15 different, different capabilities to bring together to actually create a solution. And then, to get even more fun these days, those solutions are then ever changing and dynamic and ever evolving. So you don't get to just glue it together, the hot glue gun anymore and say, here's your solution. Next week, it's probably obsolete. And I think, back to some of the timeline things that we are running into, we're out here watching anywhere innovation's going on. With the DoD, a lot of times a solution will be proposed and it might already be obsolete. And so how do we truly get these two worlds? So the commercial sector, world-class talent, and private capital, I'll even throw in patient capital. We can get to that in a minute. And our Department of Defense and our tip-of-the-spear operators in a world where they can regularly communicate. And so quickly, when we've got RFPs or we've got, different solicitations out there or CSO through DIU, see, here I go. By the time we get the RFP out there, and then by the time companies are allowed to start applying for that, there are many rules still in place where you can't even speak to the team. And out here, what investors do, they speak to the team for 6 months, for 12 months. They try to figure, they're investing in the team. It used to be, how do you invest in a company? Is it technology? Is it team? Is it location? It used to be team, location. And then with COVID, scrap the location. And it's just, you're investing in the people. And especially now with the, all the problems, national problems that we're looking at that are so dynamic, you're betting on, is this the team that can help us continue to change the way that we are thinking about a solution to this massive problem? I think another tipping point I think that we've seen in the investor community, there was a long time that investors really didn't want their companies entertaining the idea of working with government or defense. It took too long. There was no transparency. Frankly, we have all these classification challenges, and we can talk more about that. That's a big, big challenge. Also, another thing I think that we don't talk about actually inside the government is turnover. Because out here, you build very trusted relationships between entrepreneurs and investors. When an investor puts money into a company, it's like a marriage. It really is. You are working together constantly. And you've got one providing resources and one usually providing the technology and then the talent. And so that has to be a trusted relationship. And so I think when the commercial sector and the investor community start to build relationships with folks inside the government and inside the Defense Department, and then 3 years later, that person's gone, or 2 years later, that person's gone, it feels like you're starting from scratch. A lot of times companies, just as we say, just don't have time for that. And so how do we create somehow folks on the inside that can stay in roles? I know it's very challenging. I was speaking to a 2-star over at SAF AQ, and he chose not to get promoted because he wanted to stay in the job he was in because he was really making severe traction, like in a very positive way with the investment community. And as they were launching, putting together Space Force. And he's like, if I leave right now, somebody else is going to come in. Who knows if they're going to continue my programs, continue the things that I'm looking to change to help these two communities work together, or if they're going to come in with their own ideas and start over. That's a big challenge that we're facing. I'll say the last thing, and then I promise I'll let you ask another question. But classification is a really big issue, and the ability to have, I'm not even going to say top secret. I'm just saying, conversations that might be a little bit more sensitive. We started looking at kind of trusted capital, and how do we look at, it was really about 2018. There's about $22 billion in Chinese money that came into, we'll say, Silicon Valley just alone. 2018 was one of the years of the most capital coming into the Valley, but then 2019, there was a big wall. People started to say, wait a second, what's going on here? There's IP being stolen. The idea of a trusted capital marketplace was born, and the idea of how do we know who's trusted and where their dollars are coming from, who their LPs are. The Defense Investor Network was born out of an idea of not building out an opaque government website to do that sort of work, but actually building a network of investors that could trust each other. And then we can bring folks from inside the military and inside the government to talk to this group of trusted investors to say, these are the sorts of things that we need.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was going to ask you about adversarial capital, because for people that are listening, the average startup or entrepreneur doesn't really understand how big of a deal this has been in the past. Is that a lot of VCs were unwilling to fund defense of any kind because a good portion of the capital coming in from places that we would now deem as adversarial capital. So they're not going to invest in Palantir or Shield or Anduril or any of the now defense darlings that have millions or hundreds of millions of investment in, because they wanted certain relationships with existing capital partners. And so that conversation has shifted, but it's not really something that people think about. They would make an appeal to moral argument. Hey, we don't want to be involved with defense or the warfighter, which I think is a flimsy argument. I could give you a million reasons why innovation into defense is an existential requirement, and it's really the lifeblood of our economy in a lot of ways. Nathan Mintz was on from Spartan Radar and previously Epirus. And he was saying with Epirus, he went to Joe Lonsdale and Joe said, I want you to start this startup. Here's $3 million. Call your job, quit. You're going to do Epirus. And because they had this relationship and the capital was there and the mission was there and all of those pieces, and those relationships or that situation is very special, but really shouldn't be as special as it was at that time. Because the needs are there, the opportunities are there, and the smart people are there, honestly. Yeah, adversarial capital versus now trusted capital is a conversation that all the startups should be thinking about. Who is investing in your company? Is it smart money? Is it smart money if I'm thinking about a dual-use startup? There's a lot more conversations to unpack now in the last 3 years where, quite honestly, hardware defense startups, which is what I do, that's the hot thing. That's what everybody wants to invest in now. And I feel like I have exited a hall of mirrors and can see the light for once in the last 10, 15 years. Great conversation to have. And certainly you're the right person to have this conversation with.
When you talk about, the startups are looking for, now cleaner money. And I feel like we put so much of the onus on the startups, and I think it's a little unfair. I think we need to put more of the onus on the investors and being upfront about where their money's coming from. And frankly, like you said, making some of those choices, where are they going to take their dollars from? And what does that mean? And then being slightly more transparent in a still litigious way. I spoke recently to AFRL has a quantum portfolio, and, they said we are getting term sheets for $100 million from an investor that looks nefarious. We're all working as fast as we can, and the amounts of money that they need is massive. You've got quantum companies raising $450 million in a round these days. It's almost an impossibility to say, no, thank you. I don't want your $100 million check at really ridiculously good terms. We know what's going on there. And so I think, shedding some light on it, but then creating ecosystems of vetted investors. I mean, this whole thing started, as we were looking to go left of CFIUS. Let's make CFIUS stronger, better. Great. But why don't we go left of CFIUS? Why don't we make it so that these companies aren't going to get stuck in CFIUS? Because if you are a startup of a certain size and you get put through CFIUS review, you can die. That's not an exaggeration. How do we keep all of that from happening? I know that there are, a number of folks that I know and trust that have left government and are now doing certain work to help vet investors, vet companies. You might have a VP of engineering that is stealing all your stuff. Do we know who's actually running the companies and where they're getting their intel from? There's a lot of it going on. I don't think it's as difficult as we've made it, but we can't just pretend it doesn't exist anymore and turn our head the other way. I think this is, the time is now to have a conversation. And part of the investor network is educating each other about where are some good deals. If you've put some early stage dollars into something that there's national security relevant, there's national security critical, there's just stuff that we need. How do we then bring a network together so that if you've done a seed stage or a Series A for a company and they're then raising other money, how do you know that you're introducing them to folks that do have clean money and that, you can work together and they aren't going to lose sight of some of the national security goals that are really important. That's a lot of it. We jokingly call it Fight Club. There's no newsletter or website. We have sponsors. I make no money from it. BMG doesn't make any money from it. It really is just a convening force, a place to come together and actually talk about what are some national security needs? How do we deal with vetting? Frankly, I'll be really honest. Another piece of it too is speaking in market terms. When you've got private investors, what's the size of your market? How large is your market? Is this an investment that we want to make? Is this a large enough market? And what percentage of that can you take over, basically? Our military doesn't speak in market terms, yet, it's half our federal budget. And so instead of, hey, there's a $15 million opportunity for this company, what if we could figure out a way to go, across the entire DoD and IC apparatus, if not even the entire federal government? And then let's not even talk about allied governments, international governments. What is the true market size for some of these capabilities? And I think if we can start teaching our government and other governments to speak in market terms like that, we're going to get a lot of talent, a lot of bleeding edge folks who are, a lot of investors, a lot more excited. Back to the concept of timeline, capital is getting more patient. We are seeing that happening. There are traditional venture funds where you're deploying, capital the first 5 years. By year 7, you're expecting some sort of return. I'm seeing funds now that are 15 and 20 year funds that are putting it out there. You're talking about hardware. That's just hard. There's a reason it's called hardware. But even, quantum and some of these capabilities that are literally going to change the way we live, right? And we can get into hypersonics and weapon systems all you want. Like some of these things are going to take a long time. Manufacturing, you started out with that. That's massive. Talking semiconductors, how long is that going to take? I fully believe that there is enough clean U.S. patient capital out in our country for people that genuinely want to invest in the safety and security of our country. I speak to them every day. And how do we give them opportunities and create a mechanism so that they can put the money, their patient capital? Again, this isn't philanthropy. These are market opportunities that might take a little bit longer than, say, a quick flash of the pan Silicon Valley deal. But how do we direct those in the right way? How do we get information to, if not the family or families themselves, to folks that are helping manage who might have clearances, to say, these are capabilities that are necessary. Last thing though, and when you were talking about, weapons, the great news about this is if you look at the White House has their version of, 14 critical tech areas, DoD has their version. There's so much overlap there, but when it's everything, when one of those 14 things is energy and then one is cyber, and then another is AI, ML. These are massive, massive industries. If you are much more comfortable with batteries, or if you're more comfortable with hydrogen, or if you're more comfortable with pumping clean water, like whatever you are comfortable with, and as an investor, it's okay if you're not comfortable with weapon systems or weaponizing drones. That's okay. There's a lot of counter drone things that we're doing. There's a lot of things that we're doing to protect as in a defensive nature, less offensive nature. It's been amazing to watch these last 5 years how much more of this is happening. We've also had some economic downturns, and the safest industry is the Department of Defense. We're not going anywhere, and they typically ramp up during times like this.
A good example of what you're talking about, I'm going to pull in something. I know that you have experience in this as well. I've worked with Department of Energy through some of their startup programs, Solar Prize Challenge, what they're doing with American Made Challenges, and with NREL to bring in innovation. And what I tell startups is every problem the commercial market has, DoD and IC has that exact same problem, but it's a 10x problem. The TAM might not be as big from a volume, but the dollar and impact is the same. So we've done a lot in climate justice or energy equity, or from batteries to aesthetic solar panels to fieldable power, where the vast majority of that has been directly something we could translate into DoD, honestly, with almost no change to the technology at all. But if you're looking for a place to innovate, the government owns the big problems. You're right. We can pick on US Cybercom. They've done a lot better of a job. They released a sheet that said, hey, here's the 5 areas that we're interested in. Here's these subtopics. But you read through it and you're like, yeah, everybody has these problems pretty much. It's just that their problems happen to be existential issues versus, hey, I don't want some, kid to encrypt my drives and I can't get my company data. That would be really, really bad for my company. Well, the same equivalent is with threat actors in a, deployable mission. So same problem, but it might have different outcomes. But they're getting better at communicating this. And that lets people that are in the commercial sector or just working on something normal like zero trust infrastructure understand like, okay, well, we've got the smart people. Can we make a CFFC solution with the team that we have? Or is what we're working on, like, what does that pathway look like to, solve this specific problem? Or what's the context to this problem? And then they're solving for context, except and not solving for does it exist or innovation. But yeah, so I've seen this, like you said, AI is a great example of this, is like building hardware. And then what's the gap between building that hardware for the US? Well, it's supply chain, mostly, having a blue supply chain to run AI ML on something that we know is verified and not an actual listening device. But, the same thing, cyber is just like, how do we vet that? And what are the systems of vetting it? And same thing kind of with power. It's like, well, what's the difference? It has to be more rugged or, there's just this translating effort, but everything that's available in the commercial world is available in DoD. It's just very interesting to me. I want to understand from you your experience with this, because I know that you've done some work in climate tech as well. And it's always interesting to hear about that.
Yeah, no, I would love to. So let's go back a few years. This is 2012. And I had been doing some work, like I said, at Stanford, and former Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, would come out to the Valley. I heard him speak at Google, and he was talking about energy innovation in the DoD, and no one was talking about climate or energy innovation. It was this thing that you just, which I get, it looks frightening. They started with Great Green Fleet. They start with biofuels, because if you're shipping and your aircraft carriers and your jets are spewing out, all sorts of dirty everything, the rest of it doesn't matter. I mean, honestly, like, you can put some solar panels on a house. Like, if you're, if you've got aircraft carriers burning billions of gallons, of crude oil, I mean, that's literally what they were doing. And I used to have better day at the top of my head as far as just the amount of crude oil that was being burned. I started to go over to Hawaii. They were using it over in Paycom, and that's where they were running all of these programs. And we had some really great, amazing startups here in the Valley that were doing biofuels work, but there was no way for them to, no mechanism, no way for them to talk to Big Navy about any of this. And I had just had a baby, so I'm schlepping my 3-month-old around. Ended up taking this one specific company out because the state of Hawaii, as part of the Hawaiian Clean Energy Initiative, that was a DOE initiative, started talking about some grants, some early stage dollars they had for clean energy companies. It's so much more intertwined than people think, but this was kind of inconvenient truth. The Al Gore movie came out, and you see $1 trillion market, and I love you venture investors. They get really excited about $1 trillion market. But it's hard, and it takes a long time. Back to that patient piece. And there's legacy infrastructure. You need to know utilities. I mean, it's not just, you don't get to just invest in a storage company and everything's going to be great. Energy is a system. Energy is a system, and you need generation, you need storage, you need integration, you need all these transmission, you need all these different pieces. And unless you have all those pieces, including the legacy, including the utilities that you have to be working with, it's very challenging. And PG&E here is who powers half California, and they're our electric provider, and they almost kind of didn't know where to start. And they had kind of a test grid over in San Ramon. But we go over to Hawaii, and they already had like state legislation to get to, was it 60% renewable by 2030? Again, I'm botching up the numbers a little bit, but ballpark. I mean, now they have further legislation to get to 100% renewable. What does that actually mean? So if you went and talked to the utility, they had stopped letting people put solar panels. Well, you could put solar panels on your house. This is in Hawaii, where you figure everyone should have solar because it's sunny all the time. And they couldn't let residents connect to the grid, because the grid could only withstand about 15% renewable energy before it became destabilized. And so they said, we can't do it anymore. So as we're thinking about, like, holy cow, there's, Great Green Fleet, renewable fuels, that sort of thing. But Hawaii is a state for a reason. It's pretty strategic. At any point in time, there's about 2.5 days worth of food on it. That's without military insurgency. So you've got food security. You've also got, brownouts. I mean, constant. And if we've got, I know certain places in Hawaii may have certain specific and sensitive communications devices that we need to communicate globally. And so how do we make sure that those aren't, being affected by brownout, lack of power, that sort of thing. And so luckily, Connie Lau, the former chairman of HEI, Hawaiian Electric Industry, she's incredible, very high level, top down approach, but saying we are a very motivated utility and want to start looking at energy as a system. Use an island, much easier to see. California, we can buy power from Nevada if we screw up. Hawaii, not so much. And so how do we start looking at putting investments in all the different pieces of the system that is energy? And so I had an amazing opportunity to work with John Lippert and Jill Sims and the founding team over there in Hawaii. I stayed here. I got to go to Hawaii. I didn't still live in Hawaii, but we wanted to make sure there was a bridge built and a sustained bridge back to the investment community here to make sure that as we are testing out and really like metal in ground. These weren't hypotheticals, like actually getting stuff in the ground there, taking that data, then running basically a work program. So we didn't intentionally make it look like In-Q-Tel, but there's an earlier stage, kind of a phase one. We won't call it that either, but an earlier stage customer discovery piece of it, small dollars. And then there's actually the demonstration stage, which is again about $1 million with kind of either a customer or investor match. And so putting actual capabilities in there, working with startups. And I go back to, because you mentioned something about connection and connectivity. What we found was it wasn't just, here's a nice email. Here's the person, the innovation person at the utility, and here's a startup. No, it was such massive handholding and translating. And it was, no, this is what the startup actually needs from you, big utility. Startup, this is what the utility means when they say X, and this is what they need you to do. Or maybe everyone gets busy in their own world and somebody's not responding for 2 weeks. And that goes on so much, as we're trying to take a commercial sector entity and put it inside of government. There's translation needs, there's misunderstandings, there's tone challenges on emails. And frankly, there's just people get really busy. Back to an example we had with, I'm not going to sell this group out because it's, they came and spoke to the Defense Investor Network and had about 31 very clearly defined problem statements, which is a dream. That's more than signaling. That's like, this is what we need. This is what keeps us up at night. It was beautifully done, beautifully written. Oh my gosh, so succinct. And I'd never seen this list. I'm like, where do you get this? They said, well, we have a coffee the second Tuesday of the month in Maryland where you get a printed out version of this. I'm like, how's that working out for you? And we said, what if we could get these signals, these problem statements into the hands of people, investors, entrepreneurs, but investors see everything. And something I remind our DoD of, if you've got world-class talent with an amazing product or capability, the first place they're going to go to try to get funding is the investment community. They're going to go ask for money to build out this company. So investors typically see things 18 to 24 months before they're out of, we'll say, stealth mode, or they become in a place where they're kind of out in the world and selling product. What if we had that advantage? What if our DoD knew, where is the investor community, the private capital community putting their dollars now? Because where they're putting their dollars now is what's going to be reality in 5 and 10 years. But those conversations weren't happening either. I mean, now I think they're starting much more to have it. I would say this, back when back on the climate energy side, when ARPA-E was being stood up. So there's DARPA, and then ARPA-E was the energy version of DARPA, basically. Arun Majumdar, who's here at Stanford now, was the one that set that up and did, I think, a tremendous job. But at the beginning, brought in some venture investors and got reamed for it. But the idea is, like, you've got these folks that are putting their money where their mouth is, and they're looking, but they're seeing what's out there. What are entrepreneurs doing right now? What's, a lot of back to timeline, is this capability ready to be commercialized? Is this capability ready to be inside the Department of Defense? We had, I promise I'll get back to energy in a second, but we had a team from JIDO come out to the Valley a number of years ago. And this was probably, 2016, maybe early 2017. And they were looking at, for AR, VR capabilities. And I remember, they kind of their idea was they wanted to go see Oculus. They wanted to, talk to Magic Leap. They wanted to go, and then there were a bunch of other smaller kind of AR, VR headset companies. And they said, we're just going to buy, a bunch of them. And then they wanted to kind of trick out their mind hound, which is what they were searching for minds with, and kind of trick that out. So they wouldn't have to be looking, down in the theater. They could be looking up. They could have situational awareness. They could maybe have mapping and figure out where they'd already been. And they had this great idea, these great plans. And then, the first meeting was actually the head of strategy for Magic Leap at the time. He'd kind of seen the writing on the wall about where their company was going, and they took a lot of money in, and we'll stop there. But he said, if you thought about, most of these companies don't want to be hardware companies. They want to be platform companies, and they want to create the content and create the platform. They only are building the hardware so that they have a way to show you their software platform. give this 12 months, give this 18 months. They're all going to sell their hardware to Flextronics. They're going to pick their favorite, and then they're going to sell it to the masses. This was 5, 6, 7 years ago, when if you would have asked anybody in 2023, is everyone going to be walking around with some weird thing on their face? For the second time, because Google Glass had already started and not started, but this was kind of the second iteration, like, no, this is going to be real. And it's still not that real. They were basically saying, just hold up, just wait. And then it was actually the guy from Magic Leap who said, and you thought about, how do these platforms actually run? They run on gaming platforms. Who owns those gaming platforms? There's a certain country that owns the two big ones. And then developers. Do you have developer talent to actually create the sorts of things you're going to need to create specifically for DoD? Do we have that talent? Where is that talent located in the world? And these are just things that they hadn't been thinking about on any level. I think sometimes we are excited about that. We're excited to come out and to start looking for things, but timing is a really big piece of that. And how is that going to then integrate not only with defense legacy technologies, but what's happening out in the non-defense world? So getting back very quickly, Elemental Accelerator is the program out in Hawaii that has grown beautifully. We actually started with our first cohort back in January 2013. We called it the Wolf Pack. It was amazing. It was our beta. Amazing group of companies, amazing. Navy came in and actually put $30 million into the idea of using Hawaii as a test bed for energy innovation and seeing what would stick. And a gentleman by the name of Rich Carlin is incredible. He bet his reputation on it. He really did. We need that kind of leadership and people who will put their reputation on the line. And we ended up with an incredible accelerator. We're bringing companies out, both Hawaii companies, but also companies from called the Contiguous 48 out the mainland. And it also, it was incredible to watch what happened there. And then they would come back and raise money, typically off of the data that they had proven and shown. But to date, I think the number is somewhere about 160 portfolio companies, 30 million. There was another 30 million, I think, that got put in. So I think that they ended up with about $60 million of taxpayer dollars, but it's leveraged far over $2 billion in private capital from that initial investment. And then have since started something called Moonshot Ventures, which is, wow. Like that's, it was, the Navy money was taken outside. It was set up as a not-for-profit, just like InQtel. And then originally it was going to be kind of a grant program. And actually the companies were saying, we need you to have skin in the game. We actually want to give some equity back to this. And so now it's self-sustaining. Which is an incredible way to build a program. Whereas having come from an appropriations world, you'd get the same tin cups coming back every couple of years. Like, you gave me 5 million, we've spent it, I need 5 more. What about building a sustainable program in some way, shape, or form? And how do we then use and leverage private capital to do that?
Elemental has a great brand name in the space, right? I work with accelerators in climate all over the country, and we have people that have been through Elemental. So really great program. So it was interesting to see that in your background. I was like, oh, this is a little like another interesting point of connection. And God bless that Magic Leap guy. Yeah, I think sometimes you just need that engineer to tell you, here's what reality is. I do a fair amount of tech scouting, and sometimes I get to be the evangelist, but oftentimes I'm more like the person warning you, hey, there's the road's out ahead. Like that. The way you're describing that is the way it's described in Wired magazine, not in our cohort or in our company. Like, I would love to build this thing like that, but to your example, NVIDIA has put in billions of dollars to build out that ecosystem. So what they were talking about in that situation is like possibly available now, but there's literally billions and billions, like tens of billions of dollars worth of development that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years to create the infrastructure, right down to the chips, right down to the data centers, but also all the software platforms and how everything works together just to make applications like that even a proof of concept feasible. Very good example of that. I wish we could get dream fulfillment. But Heather, before we go, can you give a word of advice to ventures or startups that are like, wow, this all sounds great. How do I get started? How do I find these great problems and engage with these amazing organizations?
So before I do that, and I promise I will, and I'm going to give a lot of information, so get your pens out. But really quickly, when you talk about NVIDIA, people are, I spend a lot of time with the part of the investor community and the investor network are the venture arms of primes. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role of primes. I think they get crapped on a lot, but I think, they're trying to change. They are a necessary part of our DoD ecosystem. Again, I jokingly call the DIN Fight Club, but we've had some fights, but some conversations that are hard to have because, it was somebody who was running a multifamily office who has very little experience on the DoD side, who started kind of blaming the primes for everything. And then one of the investors from the prime, very politely came back with, hey, like they're also a massive aircraft carrier that has to change direction. And how does that, what does that look like? And so when I hear about, companies like NVIDIA and what they're doing, I think there's a new face of primes. They're building new primes. And what does that look like? And how do we talk about that, educate folks like that? But I think they're, as anytime I hear that Angel's, acquiring another company, that's a win. That's an exit for, a dual use or defense minded startup. And so there haven't been exits like that possible. Like, the DoD is not going to buy a bunch of companies, right? They shouldn't do that. How are we reviving or recreating, the role of primes and what they need to look like as the face of war is changing? But how do you get in the door? There's so many great portals, I'll call them. So the Defense Innovation Unit is based here at Moffett here in Mountain View, California. So DIU, they've created, I'm going to get this acronym, it's CSO. I always forget exactly what it stands for, Commercial Service Offering. I know that's not right. But basically a very rapid contracting vehicle. So the way they work is they are kind of repping on behalf of a customer inside the DoD or IC who has a need, who can come out with it in layman's terms. It's on their website, diu.mil, I believe it is. And then, you can kind of sign up to get their announcements. AFWorks has done an incredible job. The Air Force has put together kind of their innovation arm. Before, when you were talking about, I call it signaling and just saying, these are some of the problems that we're facing. And so when they were starting something called Agility Prime, which is eVTOLs, right? So electric vertical takeoff and lift, basically flying cars, flying taxis. And they realized that giving a $1.7 million SBIR to a company trying to build a flying taxi, not so important. And frankly, even just the reporting was going to be too much. But just being able to talk, communicate like, hey, these are 10 companies that we are watching. And frankly, there are in-kind things that they could do, like airspace to test, right? There are things that when you have a trusted relationship between, some of these worlds, can do some really cool things very quickly. And so AFWorks has done an amazing job getting SBIRs at getting early dollars to companies quickly to then, and part of their process is then to teach you then how to work with DoD. InQtel is external, and technically it's the investment arm of the CIA, but they also work with a number of other services and entities. And they can actually put dollars in as part of a work program where you're actually doing a project. It's not hypothetical. You're putting things to work and you're testing out, is this something that's needed or not? They've had a tremendous track record, I believe, and they've got some great folks, here in Palo Alto, again in DC. Naval X is doing incredible things for the Navy. They've got tech bridges now. So if you just type in tech bridges, they're, scattered all over the country. They have really amazingly qualified people running those and who want to jump in and want to start building relationships with folks. A new tech bridge opened up in London, and we're elbowing Australia constantly for them to ask us for one so that we can go AUKUS wide looking at that. But then MIU, the new Marine Innovation Unit that just launched. Any of these, we can get contact information, but they're all active on LinkedIn. And frankly, the DIU folks over there can help you out. I'm also happy to help folks out if need be. That's just a smattering. There's more than that. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch. We have this new Office of Strategic Capital that's at the OSD level, Office of the Secretary of Defense. That's looking at really working closely with the SBA and looking at changing the way that we might be able to get different sorts of dollars out to get matching and to leverage private capital. So there's a lot going on. It's very exciting. There is, the good old fashioned VC folks that I've been just really impressed about, how national security is. Again, I'm not, we're not trying to get everyone to change the way they do business, but, when you and I wake up every morning, I see the world through a national security lens. And I'd like for people to be thinking about national security as they're making choices.
I hope everybody was taking notes there. Really great information. And yeah, even VCs now more and more are a way to get into the defense market because there's so many people changing their investment thesis. Heather, I feel like we could talk for hours about this and go very deep about a lot of those conversations, but I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being on the Startup Defense.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And like I said, if you want to go deep, even in a shorter segment on something specific, I'm always game.
Thank you.